As I mentioned, I shouldn't mention this. This is a spoiler, okay. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we'll talk about the books that I read for the month of August. The first book that I read was written by Kamala Harris. It's called The Truth We Hold. The book itself is actually realistic, but it's mostly comprises of photographs of her throughout her childhood and until the present day Kamala. Chapters in the book itself are divided into different phases of Kamala's life from her childhood until her present day life, where she worked in the legal and political field. So most of the book progressed from Kamala Harris' childhood, where she is raised by an immigrant who's very actively involved in activism and also happened to be someone who has a career as a scientist. Yeah, her mom is both an activist as a scientist, and this pretty much helped her shaped who she is today, because her mom usually took Kamala to her workplace and usually took her to where she would perform the activism act, something like that. I'm really bad at describing this. However, this book felt less like a personal memoir, unlike the book Becoming by Michelle Obama. So this book, The Truth We Hold, focused rather on her personal achievements. So this book acts rather as a record of political and personal milestones, mainly because at the end of the chapter, the author tied everything together from her life experience regarding to the theme highlighted in the book or by the chapter on the tips or steps that the reader can take in order to make the society as a whole a better place for everyone. But the whole thing felt like it's more centralized for American citizens, for American voters, as opposed to, so you know, if you are like me, an American citizen, you will less likely be able to relate or feel the message in the book in a more personal level, because yeah, this book, the messages in this book is more closely tied to American citizens themselves. However, it took me some time to finish this book, mainly because I was too distracted by my other book in my TBR. But I think it was actually really worth dragging myself through the book, especially the middle part, because that's where it gets the most boring for me in the entire book. And I think the best part of the book is towards the end of the book, where I don't know, I think I relate more to the message at the end of the chapters there towards the end of the book. So yeah, in this book she talked about the problem and solution that she deemed the appropriate in order to tackle these problems. But I feel like a lot of the problems and solutions that she introduced were either too shallow or were too obvious to even be pointed out. But of course, there are also some aspects of problem solvings and solutions that she showed, that she outlined throughout the book, that emphasize just how intelligent she is, just how strong she is, and how strong-willed she is. I tapped a few parts with the Kindle bookmark feature, but I'm not really familiar with the feature there. So yeah, I cannot show you guys the parts that I tapped. So I gave this book 4 stars on my Goodreads. The next book that I read was The Spanish Love Deception. It is written by Elena Armas. So this book is marketed as everything that I would usually love to have in a book, especially in a rom-com, as my chill reading book. It has enemies to lovers, it has #women in STEM, it has women of color representation, and it has forced proximity, and it also features a very specific niche where the main character get to travel together with a guy that looked like Henry Cavill. Is that how you pronounce his name? Yeah. Plus point, many people mention that this book has a lot of similarities with The Hating Game, and I totally adore that book. Like, that book was one of the best books that I read for the year 2020. So yeah, okay, I wouldn't say I have any expectation for The Spanish Love Deception, because first of all, I don't really have, like, when it comes to romance book, I will try to not have any expectation to the book, because the book, when I read romance book, it's usually just for me to relax, to like wind down from my stress day, or just balance out with what I've read previously. So I don't usually have any expectation towards romance book in general. But okay, anyway, the story pretty much goes like this. Catalina Martin and Aaron Blackford are both colleagues in an engineering consultation firm, and they are both leaders of their respective departments. So yeah, there goes our #STEM representation. Dina Martin and Aaron Blackford are both conventionally attractive people who hate each other. How do we know that they hate each other? Oh, don't worry, the narrator will keep on pushing that detail to you. With every page flips, you will be informed that they hate each other so much that they cannot be working closely with each other, let alone go to a trip together. Catalina has a wedding to attend in Spain, and she is in a dire need to show up with a partner, because how else is she going to prove that her life is not that terrible despite having a stable job. That wouldn't be enough, right? And as I was saying, Aaron wouldn't stop offering himself to Catalina as her wedding date, as the date to the wedding, despite the apparent strained relationship between them. They hate each other, right? Supposedly, but then Aaron can't stop himself from being a creep and keep asking Catalina to bring him as her wedding date. You know what? It just makes so much sense. You know what? All the back and forth kept going on in chapter 1. Like, I still remember vividly how the first chapter only told about Aaron telling Catalina that she has to bring him, otherwise she wouldn't have anyone to bring as the wedding date. That's all that happened throughout half of the book. Like, chapter 1 is all about that. There's nothing really going on other than that, and I thought it will only last for about 3 to 4 chapters, but no, nothing really happened other than Aaron convincing Catalina to bring him throughout the half of the book, and the actual plot happened during the second half of the book, which actually not really that much. And at this point, I was wondering what was his motive. Don't they hate each other? Isn't this promoted as enemies to lovers? And obviously it isn't enemies if one party is so obviously obsessed with each other. It isn't enemies to lovers if there is no slow burn. And as I was saying, I thought this stupid thing will only go back and forth for about 3 to 4 chapters, but guess what? Nothing really happened throughout the book, but that's not actually the worst thing about the book. So Catalina is supposed to hate Aaron, right? But every time he breathed, all that she could rant about was how shimmering his blue eyes are, and how chiseled his jawline are, and how wide and perfectly built his shoulder and his chest are. There is another character introduced, and her name is Rosie, and she's supposed to be Catalina's best friend. And the conversation between Catalina and Rosie is really bland, and I don't really care for her character. They don't talk about anything other than Catalina's personal matter. I personally just hate friends like Catalina, and I couldn't imagine having a friend like Catalina. Like, all she does is talk about herself. On top of that, I feel like you could remove Rosie completely from the story or from the book, and the story wouldn't actually change that much. And Catalina is actually super oblivious to Aaron's gesture. That is so obvious. Now that I think about it, the only reason why Catalina is supposed to be oblivious towards Aaron's gesture is only for 2 reasons: for the plot progression, and because the author doesn't have any other idea on how to market the book other than marketing it as enemies to lovers, because they aren't enemies. The whole setting, the whole build up, the whole conversation, the whole dialogue, the whole prose, the whole narration is just too pretentious for me to enjoy the book overall. And the conflict in this book is too cartoonish, and I feel like there's no real depth to any conflicts that are portrayed in the book other than maybe the sexism, yeah, I think, but then it's not really touched that much. The conflicts are introduced or portrayed for the sake of the plot that is actually not that existent, not that good either. And Aaron Blackford is the worst love interest in any books that I've read this year. To say that this book is a Walmart version of The Hating Game is a stretch, because this book is a failed attempt of The Hating Game. And overall, this book just makes me want to take a break from any romance contemporary genre for a while. It just traumatizes me. And as you can probably tell, I gave this book 1 star out of 5. The next book that I read in August was Pet Sematary. The book opened with Louis Creed and his family. The book opened with Louis Creed and his happy little family who recently just moved to Ludlow Place. It is located somewhere in Maine, and somehow Stephen King's stories are always set in Maine. Louis Creed got this job offer in a university in Maine as an attending physician in a local university. Louise and Rachel has 2 beautiful children, Ellie and Gage, and they live together with a cat. Louise is introduced to a peculiar man who happened to be introduced as someone that is old and wise, but yet really caring towards Louise and his family, and he's the one who's responsible in introducing Louise to the pet cemetery. You know what? After this point, there's actually several spoilers. If you don't want a spoiler, you can skip to this timestamp over here. So yeah, during one of his shift, the university hospital that he worked in was morbidly surprised with the arrival of a fatally injured student, Victor Pascal. Soon we learned that this is the first time the hospital ever received such a tragic case in so many years that the hospital has operated in the university. And yeah, Louis tried to help him, but there's nothing much he could do because it's mentioned in the book that he arrived in a really tragic condition. In other words, he's unrecoverable. So Louis tried to help him, but there's not much to be done, so he was pronounced dead shortly afterwards. However, towards the end of that part, before Victor dies, he did say something to Louis. Note that Louis has never met Victor Pascal before, and Louis was absolutely sure that Victor doesn't know him either. However, did mention something about the Pet Cemetery and warned him about Pet Cemetery to Louis. So later that night, Victor Pascal's spirit visited Louis in his dream and again warned him something about the Pet Cemetery. But this time he does so by inducing a sleepwalking to bring Louis to the vicinity of the Pet Cemetery itself. But is there more to the Pet Cemetery than what meets the eye? What is the legend behind the Pet Cemetery anyway? Read the book to find out. Before I read this book, I actually watched the 1984 adaptation of this book, so I do get the general idea of the story before I read the book. But even if you watch the movie or haven't watched the movie, the book is told in a way where it will keep on predicting what will happen in the next chapter or in the next act, but it does so in the most subtle way possible. And I think this kind of perspective or this kind of narration or this kind of point of view, and I read about it, and it's called something like the omniscient point of view, where the narration or the narrator tells a story that is beyond the knowledge of the character themselves. So yeah, in essence, before an event happened, it will always be hinted before. So even if you know the general plot of the story, the surprise element, the thriller element will not be taken away from you. You will still enjoy the story the same way. And like every other Stephen King books that I've read in the past, the beginning and the world building of this book is really slow. But I like the world building in this one. In fact, it makes me care so much more for the characters. I think it's the attachment that's formed between the reader and the character is what contributing to whatever emotion that you will feel towards the end of the book. Whether it is an amplification of a present feeling of grief, whether it is a pure sadness from having to depart with the characters, I think it depends on how you feel about the characters in the beginning of the story. So Louis' complexity and his emotion and feelings were so very in that I feel like I'm in his head instead of I'm reading a story about him. The plot itself is not actually that detailed, but I think that's the author's intention. There are a lot of symbolisms going on throughout the book that I cannot elaborate on in this video without spoiling it for you guys. So yeah, so in the end, I was left with so many questions at the end of the book because the book didn't explain much of the details. Like, is Louis Creed's family fated with that kind of tragedy? Can the evil spirit that is mentioned in the book attack people from distance? How does the evil spirit have so much power that it can delay flights and make other things so inconvenient for the characters and convenient for the evil spirit itself? How powerful is the evil spirit that is mentioned in this book, aka the villain? I think the evil spirit itself is the villain. I'm not going to tell you what its name is because I think it's kind of spoiling the story, even though you will know it's a villain. But yeah, I wouldn't tell you the name of the evil spirit so that it won't be as spoiled for you as much if you plan to read this book. So in essence, I love this book, but I found that the ending was a little too rushed. Overall, I gave this book 4.5 stars out of 5 stars. The next book, which is the last book that I read for the month of August, is When No One Is Watching, written by Elisa Cole. This book is a romance thriller and it highlights social injustice. Like, that's the ongoing theme of this book, social injustice, specifically gentrification. The plot goes like this. There's this girl, her name is Sydney Green, and she is recently divorced and she moved back to her mother's house in Brooklyn, where, you know, she grew up there. She spent most of her childhood there. She knows the neighborhood by heart and she knows everyone who lives in that neighborhood. They are basically living like a family because they are living in such a small and close community. Everyone's like a family. Sydney lived in that house with her best friend Rhea. We were not told where Sydney's mom is at the beginning of the story, but it will get unwrapped at the end, towards the end of the story. However, upon settling to her neighborhood, she quickly felt something was wrong. She left feeling unsettling. She left feeling like, you know, something is off about this neighborhood because the landscape of her neighborhood changed so quickly. Her neighborhood that used to be filled with black families were quickly replaced by white couples. She knows all these neighbors since she was a child, and she knows that they wouldn't have left so sudden without any notice at all. I mean, they were neighbors, they were like families. There must be at least some notice if they moved to somewhere else. So, you know, as more of these sudden disappearance of people happening, because more and more of her neighbors were suddenly disappearing, Sydney felt like something is up. And coincidentally, while all of this is happening, we are introduced to another main character, Theo, who happens to be one of Sydney's new white neighbor. He lived with his toxic girlfriend Kim, and she's toxic to everyone in her circle except if you're rich and if you're white. She's racist, she's rude, she's everything bad in a character. There's actually no redeeming qualities in her at all. So you know, I just felt like her character was a little bit too flat, too cartoonish, too two-dimensional. And as the story goes, Theo and Sydney were tasked with a task of conducting research regarding the neighborhood for a tour that is going to be held for the newcomers of the neighborhood, if I'm not mistaken. However, throughout this process of finding facts about the neighborhood to be shown in the tour, they find many unsettling facts about the neighborhood, and a lot of things started to get weirder and messier. Read the book to find out more. So yeah, this book is told in a two-point of view style, where we get to see the story from Theo and Sydney's perspective. I like how this thriller is indeed scary, because sometimes I'm left disappointed at the end of thriller because it's not as scary as I thought it was going to be. And I think that the execution of having the romance genre and the thriller genre, I think that the combination of these two genres together in this book is quite harmonious. It blends cohesively, and I love reading about that, and I love that aspect of that in this story. I like how the book has no fancy or hard to understand prose, and I found it really easy to finish the book in like one sitting. So what I hate about this book is the one-dimensional villain, because at the end of the book I was like, so that is the villain? That's it? I mean, I do like the revelation at the end of the book, aside from the fact that the villains that are revealed are like too lame for me, because like if they were the villain, I could have predicted it right from the start. So yeah, I think the last chapter could be a lot better. The author could answer a lot more things, the author could unravel more things, could talk more about the gentrification. So yeah, I think the conclusion of this book was a little too rushed for me to really appreciate the story. I gave this book 3.5 stars out of 5 because while I dislike the ending of the book, but I appreciate the plot throughout the book. I liked the world building, I like the neighbors, I like the setting, I like the theme. So yeah, 3.5 stars from me. Thank you so much for watching. I will be doing other bookish content. So if you guys would like to see any content from me, vlog, reading vlog, readathon, please comment down below. See you next time, bye!